The mirror arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, its frame carved from dark, twisted wood that looked like writhing vines frozen mid-movement. Lydia hadn't ordered it, nor did she know who sent it. The delivery man shrugged when she asked. "Looks expensive," he said, wiping the rain from his cap. She considered sending it back, but curiosity won. The mirror was beautiful in a haunting kind of way, and her sparse apartment could use a touch of character. She set it against the wall in her bedroom, near the window where it caught the soft morning light. That first day, it reflected her perfectly, her unkempt hair, her tired eyes, and the faint smile she gave it as she adjusted its angle. But that night, as the rain hammered against the window, Lydia woke to a soft tapping sound. It was coming from the mirror. She sat up, her heart pounding. The mirror stood exactly where she'd left it, the glass faintly glowing in the moonlight. She rubbed her eyes, chalking the sound up to the storm, and lay back down. But then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, the reflection moved. Not her reflection, something else. She turned her head sharply to face the mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same. It was her, but younger. Maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a pink dress Lydia hadn't seen in decades. The girl stared back with wide, unblinking eyes, her face pale and expressionless. Lydia's chest tightened. "What the hell?" she whispered. The girl raised her hand and waved slowly. Lydia didn't move. Then, the girl's lips began to move, mouthing words Lydia couldn't. The girl's lips moved soundlessly, forming words Lydia couldn't hear. She leaned forward instinctively, her breath fogging up the cold glass. "What are you saying?" Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. The girl stopped. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her wide eyes locking onto Lydia's with an intensity that made her stomach churn. Slowly, the girl pointed behind Lydia, toward the darkened corner of the room. Lydia froze, her blood turning to ice. She didn't want to turn around. She couldn't. But something, call it morbid curiosity or sheer terror, forced her to glance over her shoulder. There was nothing there. Just shadows pooling where the pale moonlight didn't reach. She turned back to the mirror, but the girl was gone. The reflection was normal again, just her wide-eyed, pale face staring back. The next morning, Lydia convinced herself it had been a dream. She'd been working too hard, barely sleeping, and maybe the storm had messed with her head. She avoided the mirror as she got ready for the day, her eyes darting to it only once. Nothing unusual. Just her reflection. But by the afternoon, something strange began to gnaw at her. She started remembering things, odd, fragmented pieces of her childhood. The dress the girl had worn. A room she hadn't thought of in years. A face, no, 2 faces. An image flashed in her mind, her parents, standing in a dark room, their faces pale and grim. And the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the silence was worse. It pressed down on her like a weight. At 3:12 a.m., she woke up gasping, her chest tight. The mirror glowed faintly in the darkness, though there was no light source to explain it. And this time, she wasn't alone. The girl was back, but she wasn't standing still anymore. She was pacing the confines of the mirror, her bare feet slapping against an unseen floor. Her movements were frantic, her small hands pressing against the glass as if she were trying to push through it. "Stop," Lydia said, her voice barely audible. "Just stop." The girl froze. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Lydia's. And then she smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was too wide, too sharp, her teeth unnaturally white. Lydia scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping over the sheets. The girl raised one hand and began to scratch at the inside of the mirror. A faint screech filled the room, like nails on glass. "Why are you doing this?" Lydia cried. The girl mouthed one word, "Remember." Over the next few days, Lydia's world unraveled. The mirror became a constant source of dread. During the day, it reflected nothing out of the ordinary. But every night, the girl returned. And each time, she showed Lydia something new. One night, the mirror became a window into a familiar room, a small, dusty attic filled with forgotten toys and broken furniture. Lydia recognized it instantly. It was her childhood home. In the center of the room stood a trunk. Lydia hadn't thought about that trunk in years. It had been locked, always locked. She remembered her parents warning her never to touch it, never to ask about it. But in the mirror, the girl walked over to the trunk. She knelt beside it, her fingers running over the rusted lock. "No," Lydia whispered, shaking her head. "Don't open it." The girl turned to her, smiled that unnatural smile, and opened the lid. The next morning, Lydia couldn't take it anymore. She drove 3 hours to the house she'd grown up in. It had been abandoned for years, but the key still worked. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. She climbed the creaking stairs to the attic, her heart pounding with every step. The trunk was there, exactly where it had always been. Her hands shook as she knelt before it. The lock was gone, rusted away. She hesitated for a moment, then lifted the lid. Inside was a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, its glass eyes clouded over. Something about it made Lydia's skin crawl. Beneath the doll was a faded photograph. It showed her as a child, standing beside her parents. But there was someone else in the picture, a little girl in a pink dress. Lydia's blood ran cold. She didn't have a sister. The girl in the photograph was the girl from the mirror. That night, Lydia confronted the mirror. She stood before it, gripping the photograph tightly. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" The girl appeared, her face blank and expressionless. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed at Lydia. "Me," Lydia whispered. The girl nodded. And then, for the first time, she spoke. "You let them forget me." The room went cold. Lydia's breath fogged the air as a memory surfaced, one she had buried deep. Her parents fighting. Her mother crying. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. And the girl. Always the girl, watching from the shadows. She wasn't a sister. She was something else. Something that had lived in the house. Something her parents had tried to hide. Something they had sacrificed to keep their families safe. The mirror began to shake, its surface rippling like water. The girl stepped forward, her hand pressing against the glass. Lydia tried to run, but the mirror's pull was too strong. Her body froze as the girl's hand broke through, cold fingers wrapping around her wrist. "You forgot me," the girl hissed, her voice echoing with fury. "Now you'll take my place." The last thing Lydia saw before the world went dark was her own reflection, smiling back at her with the girl's unnaturally sharp teeth. When the police found Lydia's apartment weeks later, the mirror was gone. In its place stood a small trunk, its lid slightly ajar. No one dared open it.